Washington, D.C.
Breaking tonight, Trump disclosures. Crossing the terminal just moments ago, President Trump's annual financial disclosures have been released by the Office of Government Ethics. We'll bring you more details as we have them. Plus, Decision Day, the President Trump closes its term with a major defeat for the president. The justices upholding birthright citizenship and striking down his executive order, but granting Republicans a win in a separate campaign finance case. Plus, the view from the Hill, President Trump's push to pass the Save America Act has logjammed lawmakers, with Republicans tying the voter ID measure to must-pass defense legislation. Now lawmakers plan to head out of town late tonight for their July 4th recess, pushing any action on the defense bill to mid-July. We'll get reaction from lawmakers this hour with Representatives Nick LaLota of New York and Greg Stanton of Arizona. Plus, on the ground, U.S. envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff arrive in Qatar for indirect talks with their Iranian counterparts. No direct meeting on the books and major obstacles remaining as a fragile ceasefire is tested. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons, alongside Joe Matthew.
All right, Kaylee, we've got headlines crossing the terminal right now with the breaking news that you just mentioned, the U.S. government releasing President Trump's annual financial disclosure. That comes with the vice president as well. We want to mention, and we'll have a lot more on this momentarily, what we're learning first. That Rolex, the watch company, gifted President Trump U.S. Open tickets worth $25,000. Also, some interesting trades here. With regard to the president's personal stock holdings, Donald Trump bought at least $100,000 in Palantir shares, although we ran a headline saying that was equal to at least $1 million in Palantir shares, $5 million in NVIDIA shares, and $5 million more in Apple shares. We expect to learn quite a bit more as we work our way through the hour, and we'll be following the headlines on the terminal. But we kick off our coverage this evening with the series of decisions from the Supreme Court today, the final opinions of this term, with justices handing the president a mixed bag. Upholding birthright citizenship, rejecting the president's effort to restrict it by executive order. They also struck down longstanding federal limits on spending by political parties in coordination with candidates and allowed states to ban transgender girls and women from competing on girls' and women's sports teams. These cases will, of course, have wide-reaching implications for years to come. And here to start us off is Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr, who was with us live in Washington after a couple of very busy days here, Greg. Interesting to see a divided court on an issue so important as birthright citizenship. What stuck out to you here?
Yeah, so big loss for the president on this issue, perhaps closer than some opponents of the president might have liked. The court was 6-3 in saying Trump overreached by trying to restrict birthright citizenship. The court, in an opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts, said the Constitution's 14th Amendment, the people who framed that post-Civil War part of the Constitution, envisioned that everybody who is born in this country on U.S. soil would have the right to participate in the political community as a citizen. The court said the restrictions that Trump tried to put in place violated that constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm.
Well, so when we consider that it is a constitutional amendment, it begs the question of whether there is further recourse for this pursuit. The president has suggested Congress could just pass a law, but is that likely to withstand legal challenges even if they were to do so?
Yeah, it's not really clear how that would happen. So one member of the majority, Brett Kavanaugh, actually would have ruled for Trump on narrower grounds, statutory grounds, not the 14th Amendment. And he said he saw a path for Congress to enact these restrictions themselves. But it's not at all clear that the majority of the court would accept that. They seem to think that the Constitution guarantees this right, meaning that neither the president nor Congress can infringe it.
Really interesting as well in the ruling that essentially throws out longstanding federal limits on political parties' ability to coordinate with candidates. This brings us directly to campaign finance reform. We heard earlier from Rick Davis, our Republican strategist who helped to draft McCain-Feingold, who said this was the final shovel of dirt on the casket of campaign finance reform. What will this mean for the electoral system?
So it will mean that political parties have more power. They can spend more money in coordination with candidates, and they can benefit from lower ad rates that candidates get. So they will have more power vis-a-vis outside groups. And in the short term, it will probably help Republicans. The Republican Party organizations have more money right now that they can now use and benefit from those lower ad rates. And we may see, in fact, a lot more ads leading up to the election.
All right, Bloomberg's Greg Stohr helping us close out this term for the Supreme Court. Great work, Greg. As always, thank you so much for joining us. And now for a closer look at how the White House is reacting tonight and an update on where those U.S.-Iran talks stand in Doha. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko. So, Michelle, as I mentioned, the president obviously not happy with the outcome in the Birthright citizenship case. He would like to look to Congress to amend that, if you will. But when we can take this term on net, were there more wins for the president and this White House than losses?
Well, I think you have to separate what he calls a win, what he declares a victory versus what might actually play out further. I mean, this is always the big question, Kayleigh, when we're looking at these legal cases and the White House's interpretation of them. Of course, Trump will try to declare victory wherever and whenever he can and try to jawbone a victory in that case. So there's a lot of questions, of course, about how this will be implemented, how this will play out, just as we had questions after the tariff rulings and how the Trump administration reacted to those, both in word and in deed. So that, I think, remains to be seen on a lot of fronts.
Interesting to hear, or I guess read the words of the president on Truth Social following the ruling. It took some time before he posted this, but he said the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, which is too bad for our country, but we can easily make it up in Congress through legislation with the support of the president that has now been determined during this process. No long and unwieldy constitutional amendment is necessary. He doesn't really think, I'm assuming, that there are votes for that, does he?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell, but this also could be a sign of his further play with Congress. Of course, you have to put this into context after a week in which he was dueling with the GOP and then kind of came to a sort of semi-kumbaya moment after a GOP luncheon with some party leaders that basically kind of gave in to his wishes on Iran and other issues. So I think, that's a complicated, fraught relationship with Congress, but, he may be just talking up nothing, or he may be really kind of planning to move forward.
It's hard enough to craft a budget right now, never mind.
That's for sure.
A constitutional amendment.
That's for sure.
Just in 20 seconds, you mentioned Iran. Do we have anything to report out of the indirect talks in Doha today?
No, I think as ever today, there is mystery, doublespeak, uncertainty surrounding these talks in Iran, most certainly on the agenda. After a weekend of tit-for-tat strikes, there's a lot to be resolved around Hormuz and the management thereof or the lack of, which the U.S. would like to see a very free strait. So things that are ongoing in talks, but also more immediate and more urgent. And at the same time, it seems to be that there's no real movement or certainty around the fate of this $300 billion fund that the U.S. has promised that allies will contribute to. We're not quite sure which allies will do that. And at the same time, those same Gulf allies are, some of them under fire from Iran in the tit-for-tat strikes, but also questioning their own role in all of this, with Oman, for one, kind of giving a lot of doublespeak on what they're favoring. We have different headlines showing, whether or not they might be in favor of a fee system and are working with Iran to discuss that and try to work that out, versus, promoting this sort of air of we want a free strait that they've said they would be in support of, with France and others who have said so.
Michelle, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko helping us understand an important day in politics in Washington. I will mention another headline that just crossed the terminal with regard to President Trump's financial disclosures. This could be a slow drip and a steady one throughout the course of this hour as we mine through dozens of pages. The president disclosing at least hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto income. That follows the disclosures of $5 million at least in shares of NVIDIA, $5 million in Apple, and at least $1 million in Palantir shares. Joining us right now to talk about much more that came out of the Supreme Court today, and of course the action that we're seeing on Capitol Hill, is Republican Congressman Nick LaLota of New York, a member of the House Appropriations and Homeland Security Committees, and a retired Navy lieutenant. Congressman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. We always have a lot to talk about when we get together, and today is, of course, no exception. You're from New York, represent parts of a very diverse area in this country. You were a naval officer and served with people from all corners of the country. Were you relieved by the Supreme Court's ruling today on birthright citizenship?
No, in fact, I'm a little disappointed, to be honest. The 14th Amendment created, just after the Civil War during Reconstruction, in my opinion, was intended to ensure that children of free slaves would become United States citizens. I don't think it was designed for this tourism citizenship where folks are coming here, Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, 7, 8, 9 months pregnant, having their babies here. Those folks becoming U.S. citizens. I don't think it was designed for that, and I don't think it was designed for people who are here illegally to give birth to their offspring, and those folks becoming United States citizens here. I'm disappointed in the ruling.
So you're writing the bill for the president?
There's a bill by one of my colleagues from Texas, Representative Brian Babin, who has a bill on point that I'm considering co-sponsoring soon. We should clean this up. We shouldn't have magnets for illegal immigration. We shouldn't have sanctuary city policies. We shouldn't be giving taxpayer-funded hotels and health care to migrants. We should be darn proud about being United States citizens. And I've traveled this world with our great Navy, visited 20 different countries, fell in love with this country, and really had a larger appreciation for American citizenship. It's something we should be proud of. We should have a path for folks to apply legally towards that, but we should protect citizenship every chance we get.
Well, just on the question of citizenship and this being the 14th Amendment that the court decided to uphold today, how confident are you that even if legislation were to pass your chamber and the Senate, that would withstand court challenges? Does it not actually need to be a constitutional amendment process that would require 2/3 ratification?
Yeah, so I think you may have a couple of legal scholars on here who may opine strongly on that, but my reading of the opinion by the court left the door open for Congress to act in conjunction with the House and the Senate, ultimately having a bill signed by the president. I do think there's a legislative path to narrow the scope, to perhaps limit birthright citizenship to those who are lawfully present in the United States and those who are not on some sort of tourist visa. I think there is a legislative path forward for us to consider, one that I hope that both Republicans and Democrats could find a way to support.
All right, Congressman, that, of course, was not the only decision made today. We had an important one when it comes to political spending that's said to benefit Republicans. Federal limits that had been in place for some time were thrown out by the court, allowing parties to coordinate, of course, you know plenty about this, more closely with candidates. Will this help Republicans in the midterm elections maintain control of the House?
I think politically, for at least this cycle, it does favor Republicans. When you look at all the different amounts of campaign finances that our different committees have, we're all in the black. We've been raising money. We've gotten a lot of support from some hardworking people across the country for quite some time. Conversely, a lot of the Democrat committees are in the red. And I think their national committee owes a couple of $1 million, while ours might have a couple of $100 million on hand. I would say, at least in the short term, politically, this favors Republicans, but not all elections are won just merely by spending. They're won often by issues and who are stronger on issues. And of course, this week we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the passing of the working families tax cuts that my constituents are quite pleased about, reduced taxes on tips and overtime and Social Security. And of course, New Yorkers love the quadrupling of the state and local tax deduction. So the money's important, but I think the issues are much more important. And us Republicans come November are going to be talking a lot about the tax savings that we've provided all hardworking Americans during our last 2 years.
Well, of course, you did pass that one big, beautiful bill last year, but the House is struggling to pass anything for the floor action to move forward over debate about the Save America Act. We saw a rule fail in your chamber this afternoon. And Congressman, my understanding is you're all going to get sent home for the July 4th recess. How do you get out of this situation? Is the Save America Act passable?
Well, the Save America Act did pass in the House, and we could probably pass it again if we had to. The question is really in the Senate. Some folks there are very married to the filibuster, requiring a 60-vote threshold in order to pass any legislation. I'm skeptical that if Democrats had the trifecta, the House, the Senate, and the White House, that Democrats would honor that 60-vote threshold. And I think that some of my Republican colleagues in the Senate should really think long and hard of whether their colleagues from across the aisle would in in fact, if the shoe was on their foot, honor that as well. The Save America Act is good legislation. We should have things like voter ID in our elections. Many Americans, regardless of race, regardless of party, support that as a legislative proposal. But I don't support holding up all the House business until that legislation passes. Let's keep the pressure on the Senate, but let's keep passing good bills, and let's get other good bills into law so long as we can.
Understood, Congressman. I'd like to ask you about Iran talks, which was the matter that we were discussing right before you joined us. Of course, Witkoff and Kushner are back in Doha, and we're told that they're having indirect talks right now. Iran has been kind of talking around this, saying that it's there, but they're not speaking directly to Americans. They're also claiming that they will maintain control of some sort of the strait, if only in the form of fees. Are these talks gaining traction? What are you hearing and hoping for as a Navy veteran with some 50,000 men and women trying to keep the strait open right now?
Yeah, Iran should be taken very seriously when they make their threats to America, when their leaders chant death to America, and when they try to acquire a nuclear weapon to fulfill that ambition. We should take that seriously, and we should contemplate that in the last 47 years, they and their proxies have been responsible for the death of over 2,000 Americans. It's something we should take seriously. A day or two ago, I was on a large conference call with Secretary Rubio and Special Envoy Witkoff, and they enlightened us. This is some of the conversations they were having, either directly or indirectly, with the Iranians. And Reagan used to say, with respect to the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc countries, trust but verify. But I'm here to tell you that with Iran, there is no trusting. There is only verifying, there is only leveraging, there is only holding accountable. And I'm hopeful that the deal that ultimately is struck by Secretary Rubio, with whom I have tremendous confidence, I'm hopeful that the deal holds them accountable and has demonstrative leverage to ensure that if and when they break any sort of deal, there is demonstrative consequences, because they cannot be trusted by any means whatsoever.
Well, of course, as we look for a final deal, we already are seeing oil prices coming down, Congressman, something that the president consistently talks about. But he also suggests that prices at the pump should be lower than they are already. He suggested $2.50 a gallon and has made accusations of price gouging. Do you think some of that is going on here?
I would like our government agencies to look more into that. If there are companies or different gas stations who are doing that, they ought to be held accountable. It seems like to me that with gasoline, they take the elevator up, but always the stairs down with respect to prices. And while we see oil at $70 a barrel, much lower than it was off the highs from a couple of months ago, we haven't seen gasoline prices, at least not on Main Street, drop at the same rate. We should keep our eye on it. I think some of the gasoline retailers would tell you that summer demand right now is the thing driving up those prices. But I would like our agencies to take a strong look at that. And if there are entities manipulating the market or gouging, they ought to be held accountable.
Well, you're at $4.10 on average, I see, in the state of New York, Congressman, which is quite a bit more than the $3.84 that we're looking at for the national average. How long can your constituents pay that price? The president's promising that prices will drop precipitously, but of course we're seeing it come out in the data in terms of not only spending but sentiment. Do you worry about the consumer carrying this through the summer as we walk up on the big driving weekend?
Yeah, I sure do. And New York and California, other high-tax blue states, unfortunately, have always led the nation. Things like the cost of gasoline, mostly because my state and others put a lot of state and local taxes on that. I hope that one day that might change in my state. Of course, the politics in my state, as we think about a week ago, three Mondami-backed socialists beating traditional city Democrats, suggests to me that things are not going to go into that lower tax, easier regulation path that New York ought to be on, which is partially to explain for why New York's gas prices are higher than the rest of the nation's. But I do expect that as a global economy and the global market for both the oil to hopefully stay at least around 70, if not lower, but for the gasoline prices to drop in the national economy, which I hope will have a strong impact in my state, because my constituents want to be able to enjoy the gas prices they had a year ago when the federal government under Republican leadership was doing things with respect to regulations to ensure that we were able to extract cleanly and safely a lot of the natural resources that are under our feet, and especially especially in places like my state where they won't allow you to drill for natural gas safely and cleanly, and places like the southern tier. The feds, with Republican leadership, are ensuring that's done when possible. In other places, that has increased supply, which, of course, your Bloomberg audience understands that tends to decrease prices. We should do more of that and have policies that are better for relieving my constituents and other Americans of some of the high prices they've been seeing.
Well, and that gets to deregulation, Congressman, in our final moment, and we're out of time. We just got the president's financial disclosures that revealed more than $1 billion in crypto-related earnings. Should the occupant of the White House be able to benefit from deregulation that its administration is pushing? Does that concern you?
Yeah, I haven't taken a look at those specific disclosures. As far as me, I don't trade stocks. I made that pledge when I got here 3.5 years ago. I don't trade individual stocks. I bought one gold exchange traded fund 3.5 years ago. That has happened to do okay, but I can at least tell you that members of Congress shouldn't be trading stocks.
All right, we'll leave it there. Republican Congressman Nick LaLota of New York, thank you so much. And back to that breaking news I just mentioned. The Office of Government Ethics has released the financial disclosure reports for President Trump as well as the vice president. And among President Trump's disclosures is that $1 billion, more than that, in crypto-related earnings. He also owns millions of dollars worth of shares in NVIDIA, Apple, and Palantir. So for more, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's joining live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, these are some big numbers, more than $1.2 billion in crypto earnings just crossing.
Yeah, just taking that across the wire. And I was trying to look exactly, see where those numbers came from. It wasn't from Bitcoin. Of course, a lot of it was tied to some of the other smaller coins, including Trump's own coins themselves that apparently contributed to that number. And in fact, that actually might have been a good thing, because if he had been invested primarily in Bitcoin, the world's largest crypto coin, he actually would not have made a lot of money. In fact, it was relatively flat last year, and to start the year, it's actually had a pretty rough go ahead. As far as some of the other names that you guys have been talking about, the Apples and NVIDIAs and Palantirs, of course, we're talking about some of the highest flying stocks of 2025. Some of those names, though, have actually lagged quite a bit through the first 6 months of this year. Remember, Palantir was one of the best performing stocks last year, more than doubling, but it's lagged pretty significantly over the last few months. Similar story for Apple, and believe it or not, similar story for NVIDIA, as a lot of folks who have sort of chased that tech trade have actually rotated, Kelly and Joe, into other names in that space, primarily, of course, some of the memory chip makers that we've talked a lot about on the show, including SanDisk and Micron.
Well, obviously, there are some staggering numbers that we're looking at here. And, Romaine, I suspect that we're going to be learning more as we continue to dig through where there are dozens and dozens of documents in these disclosures. But I do want to ask you about Nike. We had earnings after the bell, and it's a company that you know inside and out, having spent a lot of time with its not-so-new CEO. The reaction after the bell, what do we think? The reaction is negative, and in fact, it actually worsened once the conference call started at the top of the hour, Joe. This is a company that is still in transition. CEO Elliott Hill, his 2-year anniversary isn't until October, but so far, investors have really been kicking him, saying, look, the growth just isn't there. There is a story of growth in North America, but China steels still have a negative number in front of them, and there's been a lot of questions as to whether it can really capitalize off of some of the big sporting events that are taking place, like the Olympics earlier this year in February, and of course the World Cup that's taking place now. The company talked on the conference call that they're still seeing a lot of pressure on discretionary spending. They're still seeing a lot of pull forward with regards to some of the other items, and they're still struggling to sort of clear out some of the inventory that had gotten built up over the previous CEO, Mark Donohue. So we're now talking about a stock down about 8% here in the after hours trade, a stock that's down on a year-to-date basis, and at least for right now, people just looking for a little bit more guidance as to when that turnaround actually starts to show up in the numbers. Boy, it's been a tough slog for Nike. Romaine, thank you. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick juggling multiple stories for us at World Headquarters in New York. First came the SAVE Act. We've been talking about it. Now rescinding birthright citizenship. The agenda for Congress keeps growing, or so hopes the president, who did take to Truth Social today, demanding lawmakers, quote, start today to work on ending expensive and unfair to our country birthright citizenship, unquote. That comment, of course, coming after the Supreme Court rejected the president's planned immigration restrictions, ensuring for now that almost all Americans born on American soil are granted citizenship. Still, the ruling does not seem to have impacted President Trump's immigration push as he now turns to Congress. And for more on the story and the economic ramifications, We're joined now by Rebecca Shih, CEO of the American Business Immigration Coalition. Rebecca, this might be viewed by some as a bullet dodged. And of course, we are hearing from both sides of the political aisle this evening. So we have status quo largely. What would it have meant for our economy if the court had struck this down?
Well, the ruling today means that absolutely nothing has changed for children born on U.S. soil. And for the American economy, this means that employers can continue to plan and hire and operate with certainty. Look, Americans born in the United States, there are workers, taxpayers, entrepreneurs, caregivers. We know 46% of Fortune 500 companies are immigrants or children of immigrants. And on an annual basis, Birthright citizens contribute over $400 billion to the U.S. each year. So today's decision really means that this can continue, this economic prosperity and this continued growth.
Well, that's today's decision. When you take the other immigration-oriented decisions from the Supreme Court in aggregate, Rebecca, I wonder what you mean, especially around the temporary protected status for Haitian and Syrian immigrants. What could that mean in certain pockets of our labor market? What are certain businesses going to face potentially in the aftermath of that ruling?
At ABIC, we represent 1,700 businesses, many small businesses around the country. And what I'm hearing from our nursing homes, long-term provider care, assisted living homes is that this decision around Haitian TPS was devastating. 30% of the 350,000 Haitians who are on TPS work in caretaking in our nursing homes and long-term care homes. Many have been here for over a decade, contributing, paying taxes. And if they were to disappear overnight because of this decision, that means over 1 million U.S. citizens, senior citizens, will be left without this critical care.
Well, that's going to be a big story, obviously, in the weeks and months ahead. But you tell us, Rebecca, when will this start showing up in economic data?
I think we're seeing it today. I mean, Americans are experiencing home prices are 5 times higher than other inflationary measures. Food prices have increased by 30%. Caretaking prices have gone through the roof as well. I mean, this labor market is so tight, it's so squeezed, but the demand is there. And, you know, we have a math problem for Americans. There are 70 million who are over the age of 65 and increasing, and over 80% of those are going to require care at some point in their life. And so when there is diminishing labor, but the demand is there and rising, that's going to push up prices. So we're seeing it, and we're going to continue to see it unless there is some kind of relief soon.
When does it show up in jobs data, though? When you take a couple hundred thousand people out of the workforce, that will make a dent?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as we've seen in the job data the last few months, I mean, the only sector that's been improving and consistently improving in terms of jobs has been healthcare. And so I think over the next several months, as we're removing 350,000, there's going to be other TPS decisions coming up regarding El Salvador, Ukraine. So we're talking about well over 1 million people who are under this work authorization status. They're contributing. They've been here many 10 plus years, which means that they're working, paying taxes and being productive. When they're pulled out of the workforce, I mean, that's, you know, over this next 3 to 6 months when we're going to see, this labor really squeeze and the prices continue to push up.
Well, and as we consider the labor squeeze, it's one thing to consider the impacts of people being forced out of the country. It's another thing to consider people who may not want to take their chances coming at all if they don't believe that they have a long-term future in the United States. Just rhetorically, when you consider this administration's immigration policies and all of the different things that they've pushed, including birthright citizenship, which obviously the Supreme Court has thwarted for now, what is that doing to the sentiment of workers abroad who may have been considering the United States as a destination for their intelligence and their labor and effort, who may look elsewhere now?
Absolutely. I mean, we have companies that have reported employees, instead of coming to America, they're deciding to go to Canada, or that talent is moving to the UK or another country because they don't feel welcomed in this country. And these are people, with multiple degrees. They're here to create jobs. They're highly skilled and deciding to bring their talent elsewhere. And so that's not good, for our country, not good for our job creation. And so, we're hoping, and as business leaders, we're constantly speaking with members of Congress on both sides and with the administration that there's got to be a better way, that for people who are here contributing with deep roots, there ought to be a path to legal status. And of course, if you're a murderer, you're a cartel, nobody wants these people in our communities. And so we're smart. We should be able to make that distinction.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Rebecca Shee with us live on Bloomberg. As we turn back now to breaking news that we've been covering since the start of the program this hour, the Office of Government Ethics releasing the financial disclosure reports for the president and vice president. And among President Trump's disclosures, more than $1.2 billion in crypto-related earnings, in addition to millions of dollars held in shares of NVIDIA, Apple, Palantir, and more, all companies that, of course, have business in front of the government and the administration. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who, of course, helps to lead our congressional coverage. And, Megan, that would be, in fact, the check on a conflict of interest if there were one. This Congress has not really shown an appetite to meet this president there, though.
They have not. And of course, there's always concerns within Congress about, trading on issues of which they themselves, members of Congress, are involved with.
Isn't this why we do not have a Clarity Act?
Or a Stock Act? Yes, indeed. So I think that what is so alarming about this, or so surprising about this, is just the scope of it. It's more than 900 pages. Wow. And the $1.2 billion in earnings from crypto includes $588 billion in earnings from World Liberty Financial, which is, of course, the crypto firm that Trump and his sons and Steve Witkoff and others started. We're digging through these documents as we speak to certainly learn more, but those are the big headlines we're seeing.
Yeah, to Joe's point, I would imagine that makes the ethics conversations around the Clarity Act, which I know is the holdup for many Democrats, perhaps a bit more difficult if they have these financial disclosures to point to as a reason why they want those provisions in there. So maybe it'll be more difficult for Clarity to get through, though it had already passed the House, Megan. Doesn't seem like anything else is going to be passing the House anytime soon, though. The rule vote this afternoon, trying to tie the Save America Act to the National Defense Authorization Act, didn't go so well for the speaker. How does he get himself out of this situation after the July 4th recess?
I feel like this is something we just keep seeing on repeat, these procedural votes going to the floor and failing. And often what Johnson usually does with these is to smoke out the opposition, to figure out, okay, where is the holdup? This time, though, there were 14 Republicans. It wasn't just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. It was 14 who voted against the procedural vote on the defense bill, which is, of course, a very, it is a must-pass piece of legislation, something that generally gets bipartisan support. But this gambit to attach the SAVE Act, this voter ID legislation that Trump has been pushing to the defense bill, it didn't go far enough for ultra-conservatives like Anna Paulina Luna, and it went too far for Democrats who saw this as sort of an end run and trying to attach this extraneous and divisive legislation to the defense bill.
So everybody's going home.
They're going home. They were supposed to be here. The House was supposed to be here. The Senate's already left.
Yes.
But the House was supposed to be here through Thursday. Okay. They're voting now, and we expect them to now go home, which is a sign that Johnson wasn't able to work his caucus to get behind this.
We've got a lot of parades to march in this weekend, right?
Lots, yes.
Very true. All right, Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much. And joining us now for more on this is Democratic Congressman Greg Stanton of Arizona. He serves on the House Foreign Affairs, House Transportation, and China Select Committees. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. We have a lot we want to ask you, but if we could just begin with the NDAA and this defense policy bill, how do you expect this to go forward after you get back from the holiday recess? What will it take for the votes to be there from Democrats?
Well, look, if Mike Johnson actually wants to pass an NDA, above the heads of Anna Paulina Luna and the other holdouts, there's a simple answer. Come work with the Democrats. Actually, let's do a true bipartisan NDAA. Instead, they've thrown a bunch of policies in there that are meant to be purposely divisive, dealing with abortion or not allowing transgender Americans, patriotic transgender Americans who want to serve in the military, banning them from doing so. Come to the Democratic side. Let's work in a true bipartisan way. And then you don't have to worry about these outliers in your caucus. But of course, they don't operate that way. And that's to the detriment of the American people.
Well, so it doesn't sound like things are getting any easier on Capitol Hill, Congressman. And knowing that we're now getting into the throes of primary season, we're already up to 4th of July recess here. There's a question about whether anything else can happen. And following some of the vitriol that's been created between Democrats and Republicans, which could grow worse with a third reconciliation plan, there are a lot of folks who think we're cruising for a government shutdown in September, right ahead of the midterm elections. Are you one of them?
Well, again, if they want to work in a strictly partisan way, doing reconciliation bills, which can be done with only Republican votes and not reach out and work in a sincere bipartisan way, then we're probably in trouble, because as long as Mike Johnson operates that way, he lets extreme members of his caucus hijack the entire process. That's not good for our country. So, yes, as long as he continues to operate the way he's operating, he's going to continue to fail and give all the power to these extremist members of his caucus.
Well, when we consider what the legislative branch is doing around all of this, there's also a big question about the judicial branch today, Congressman. We obviously got the final cases of this Supreme Court's term, including the court that ruled against the president on his executive order around birthright citizenship, upholding the 14th Amendment. The president, in response to that, asked Congress to take action to amend birthright citizenship, but also said, and this is a quote, "I would like to congratulate President Xi and the great country of China on their massive birthright citizenship win." As someone who sits on the China Select Committee, how do you interpret that?
What a joke. This president, he thinks he's better than the Constitution. The Constitution is absolutely clear on this issue. People that are born in the United States of America are citizens. We have so many members of our Congress that are first-generation Americans. They're proud Americans. They're doing their civic duty, serving their community. And I think the president thinks that somehow getting rid of birthright citizenship might give the Republicans some electoral advantage. But you know what? Our Constitution is the document we are guided by, and the Constitution has no ambiguity. It is absolutely clear. You're born in America. You are a United States citizen.
I'd like to stay with you on the China Select Committee for a moment, Congressman, because a remarkable report by the Financial Times reports that Apple is lobbying the White House right now for approval to buy memory chips, which, as you well know, are in short supply and more expensive by the day here, from a Chinese company best known as CXMT. The Pentagon blacklisted that company because of its connections to the People's Liberation Army. Should Apple be allowed to buy memory chips from this Chinese firm if it means your iPad costs less money?
So the answer to that is this. There is a process in the United States to review these types of transactions for national security concerns. As you've just described it sure sounds like there would be significant national security concerns with that. But I want to prejudge it. We do have the CFIUS office, which deals exactly with this. So we have to be very careful when it comes to importing technology from China that could be used for nefarious purposes. And of course, we've got to be careful about exporting our most advanced chips, thereby giving away America's innovation leadership in the globe.
Well, as we're talking about imports and exports, let's get to what tomorrow is, which is deadline day, Congressman, for the USMCA trade agreement. Obviously, if this passes, it will be status quo for a period of time. But President Trump has even gone so far as to say that he would like to see USMCA canceled altogether. What is the greatest risk around that, of there not being a new negotiated outcome here?
That we will lose this economic competition with China. China is our biggest competitor on planet Earth. The United States needs to win that competition with China, creating a stronger economic unit in North America with our leading trading partner, Mexico, and one of our leading partners in Canada, 30% of the world market. Working together, we can defeat China in this economic battle. Oh, by the way, we need to get rid of these tariffs around the globe that are raising prices on the American people at a time when they are suffering and are driving our allies away. We've seen with Canada, they're already talking more to China and trying to get deals on electric vehicles from China to be imported, et cetera. We need to keep Mexico and Canada as close as we can to the United States, have the strongest economic unit, have a strong, secure supply chain, particularly for the semiconductor industry. That's how we win the battle with China. What the President Trump is doing, breaking up this very successful trade agreement, turning our next door neighbors away from us, that's exactly how we will lose the economic competition with China.
Well, so what would you prefer? What would be better for the country? Just let it automatically renew or have the president renegotiate it?
Let's renegotiate. Let's modernize. We always need to be modernizing our trade agreements. We should be at the negotiating
Trump's
table
at the
with
table
China.
This time, though.
Well, President Trump needs it. Look, I would argue that the USMCA was probably the greatest achievement in Trump's first term.
Can he make it
so
better?
Instead of turning away from that great achievement, he ought to lean into that achievement, get to the table, let's modernize that agreement, and let's keep this strong economic unit in North America together. Instead, he's insulting Canada, trying to call it the 51st state, or he's threatening to unilaterally bomb Mexico. That's insanity. Show leadership. Bring everyone to the table. Be the leader of this world and of this continent, and let's do a modernized USMCA. That's the greatest thing the president can do if he truly wants to win this economic competition with China.
Well, speaking of what the president's doing, or at least what individuals managing his money are doing on his behalf, we did get his latest financial disclosures from the Office of Government Ethics, Congressman, which reveal millions of dollars in positions in a number of large companies like Apple and Palantir, for example, but also $1.2 billion in crypto-related earnings. And I wonder, knowing that the Clarity Act already got through the House, if you expect that that may change the odds of actual crypto market structure legislation moving forward in this Congress, knowing that many of your Democratic colleagues in the Senate and in the House as well had concerns over ethics provisions and making sure that there were safeguards around activity that can be conducted.
Sure. Well, a better clarity bill would certainly include the administration as well, not just Congress, but the administration as well, provide some rules of the road as well, so there's not so much possible nefarious activity using crypto. But forget about the Clarity Act. What about the emoluments clause of the United States Constitution? Because so much of that money, that $1 billion+ you described, have come from direct investments by Gulf state countries into World Liberty Financial, which of course was founded by Steve Witkoff, who is gallivanting around the globe, replacing Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State, where the Americans know there are massive conflicts of interest by doing so. So that should have been completely illegal to have this foreign company directly invest in the president's company so that he can directly profit from that. And that drives cynicism by the American people, and it's simply wrong.
Democratic Congressman Greg Stanton of Arizona. It's good to have you back, Congressman.
Thank you so much.
A happy 4th of July, a safe one, I hope.
Happy
We're getting a couple of more headlines. There you go. Here's to 250. Straight out of the president's disclosures here, he was doing some selling, it appears, on the 16th of October. President Trump sold at least $250,000 worth of NVIDIA stock on the October 16th, 2025, to be clear, and sold as well $250,000 of Apple on that same day, October 16th, 2025. We'll keep pouring through these documents with hundreds more to go. Still ahead, our political panel will weigh in on all of the news breaking today, from the Supreme Court to these financial disclosures, right here on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It is a massive transfer of power from Congress to the president, and it's a transfer that transforms these agencies that Congress set up to work for and be accountable to the people into instruments of the powerful and of the executive.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We spoke earlier with the former FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly Slaughter. A name that may sound familiar, the namesake of the recent Supreme Court decision that granted the president broader powers to fire agency officials, including her. It was a decision that Trump himself today says was, quote, the biggest and most consequential decision issued by the court. Joining us now on this and a lot more, our political panel, Democratic strategist Adam Hodge, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, Bloomberg politics contributor, and Republican strategist Greta Joins. It's great to see you both. Where to begin, Greta? This is a monumental ruling when it comes to presidential powers, realizing there was a carve out for the Fed.
Sure.
The president was asked if he goes on a firing spree now, and he kind of chuckled and brushed that question off. But there are concerns that this leads to a house clean, not just in the White House, but through the entire executive branch every 4 to 8 years. Is that what we just got?
Maybe. I think that we're going to see a lot of flexing and trying to understand exactly where the president views the most important positions to enact his agenda moving forward. I do think the president has long believed that this is an authority that he had, and, you know, that's why he pushed the envelope here, and the court agreed with him. So I think we can expect changes, and we likely should.
Well, of course, he also wanted to see changes when it comes to birthright citizenship. Adam, at least for now, he's not getting that. The court struck down his executive order in a decision that was not unanimous. And I wonder what you make, not of the majority opinion, but of the dissenters, including Justice Kavanaugh, frankly, who was saying, look, Congress could do something about that. And that's exactly what President Trump is calling for now in the aftermath of the ruling.
We shouldn't have to do it. This was settled in 1850, shortly after the Civil War, 1868, settled again by the Supreme Court in the 1890s. And this should not be up for debate. And I think it is silly for Congress to waste its time on something that the Supreme Court has already said was settled law for well over a century. I think there are much clearer things that Congress should be focused on. And I don't think that you'll see a bipartisan majority emerge for any of these things in Congress, given that gas prices are still high, given that people are still struggling to get health care. Those are all key priorities that I think Congress should and will be focused on.
We talked to Nick LaLota earlier this hour. This is a New York Republican who was backing the president on this and says he's thinking about signing on to legislation to do exactly what the president is asking for here. There aren't the votes in Congress to pass that law, are there?
Not today. Okay. Well, yeah, I certainly think it would be an uphill.
You can't even keep the floor open, right?
I mean, it's been a long day in the House of Representatives. I think that, you know, the president certainly, you know, is upset. I think that he believes that he was in the right, of course. I think Congress, you know, will certainly continue to talk about immigration, and I think in a way that they believe reflects the electorate that elected them and President Trump. I think we'll, you know, see in the midterms if ultimately that messaging is helpful to them. But I do think that there will continue to be a talk about what can we do with illegal immigrants that are currently here, and focusing more on that versus birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
Well, as you talk about messaging in the midterms, when we hear everything is about affordability and the cost of living, how do you message around a president that has earned at least $1.2 billion in crypto-related earnings last year, as he's benefiting from businesses that are benefiting from his administration's deregulatory push in that space? How do you square that? The president is able to get richer while he's in office, and Americans are struggling with affordability.
You know, I think President Trump was rich before he became president, and he is rich again today.
Significantly richer.
Yes. I think that, you know, I don't think there's much messaging that needs to be done. I think the American people recognize who Donald Trump is, and ultimately, you know, his assets might be moving around a little bit as he ultimately invests in, I think, American companies that he believes should and will be profitable. You know, I think there is a broader question. I know there's been discussion around what the future is of the Clarity Act, for example, which deals with crypto. I think we could see some action on that in July. And then also, ultimately, I think Congress has a lot to reckon with its own stock trading issues. Sure. And I think that will ultimately be a sticking point as we move into the midterms.
I don't know, Adam. I think I'm going to start a crypto company. Maybe you guys want to go in with me. The thing is, there are exceptions, of course. Look, we're looking at Bitcoin right now trading for less than it was at when the president took office. Anybody remember Melania coin? That was real. It topped out right around $8.50. It's trading today for 7 cents. Trump coin topped out around $45, Adam. I don't know if you held on to your Trump coin, but that's now fallen to $1.66. How should Democrats be messaging around this to ask you the same question that Kayleigh just asked Greta?
I think this is going to be a central point that the Democrats raise. And I was just talking to senior Democrats on the Hill today, and I know that this is going to be a key central pillar. That they're going to talk about the Trump administration and the president himself, while enriching himself and engaging in all types of corrupt behavior, is doing nothing to lower costs for the American people. And when you talk about him getting a $1.2 billion from crypto, let's not forget, he also pardoned CZ, the former founder and CEO of Binance, who was also an investor in World Liberty Financial. All of this stinks. The American people can smell it. And I think it's going to be a key pillar, not just at the presidential level, but also down to the Senate level in states like Texas, where you have Ken Paxton, who's very corrupt and has been convicted by his own colleagues in the Texas legislature. You're going to see Democrats hammer that across the country in all of these key races.
Well, yeah, Ken Paxton, who is tied right now statistically with James Tallarico in the latest polling that we've seen today. Adam, as we consider President Trump, who is a billionaire, as Greta was just talking about, one who has gotten richer, that is obviously something that we're seeing certain parts of the Democratic Party railing against as we see this rise, at least in certain areas of Democratic socialism. We saw that in New York last week. Do you think we'll see it once again in Colorado as it holds its primaries today?
It's certainly one to watch, but I really think we cannot lose the forest for the trees here. The seats that will determine whether Democrats are in control are not deep blue seats in Denver or deep blue seats in the Upper East Side of Manhattan or in the Bronx. It's going to be in key swing districts in Iowa, in Ohio, even in some races in Florida, in Texas, where Democrats have a real opportunity to grow and expand a durable majority. And so that's where I think the smart money should be focused on, because those are the races that are majority makers. And the Democrats that we've recruited in those districts, they're combat veterans, they're surgeons, they're fire jumpers, right? People who are actually very well tuned to these districts that are going to decide whether Democrats take the House. And I think they're going to be really keen on running on that culture corruption message that I was just talking about.
Well, we'll be digging through those results from Colorado around this time tomorrow, I'm sure. President says you're throwing a convention, midterm convention. It's going to be in Dallas, September 9th and 10th. I'm genuinely curious, having covered a lot of what's a midterm convention? And is this about President Trump sort of shadow being on the ballot in the midterms? How do you take a state-by-state election cycle and throw it all into one convention?
Well, I think we're going to find out. I think it's an exciting and an interesting opportunity for Republicans. Obviously, there was a Supreme Court decision today that dealt with campaign finance. I think that'll be an important discussion. But Republicans getting out there and talking about issues that they believe as a party are important, and also reminding the electorate of where Democrats want to take us, which is, I would hate to always disagree with Adam, but I think on the last point is that, this push to socialism is certainly part of a lot of Democrats who are getting on the ballot. And the willingness to embrace that and reject capitalism, I think, is something that Republicans as a party want to talk about to the American people. And I think that's what we'll hear from.
We have 20 seconds left, Adam, on that Supreme Court decision that will allow the party committees to more closely coordinate with candidates. Does that really disadvantage Democrats who don't have the fundraising advantage?
I think when we've seen some of these decisions before, it seemed like it was a death knell for Democrats, and we found a way to respond. I think it is a bigger catastrophe for our democracy. There's clearly way too much money in our politics, and we would all be better served if we had far less of it determining our elections.
All right, Adam Hodge and Greta Joins, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the Terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power. Alongside Kayleigh Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.